Welcome to Real Talk Horror, the podcast where we don't just talk about horror, we dissect it, appreciate it, and maybe even find ourselves haunted by it. I'm your host, Josh Bell, and I'm thrilled to have you along for the ride today. We are continuing today our look at all things John Carpenter. Now, if you're a fan of suspense, thrills, chills, Carpenter's name probably already sparks memories of iconic films like Halloween, The Thing, or They Live. But before Michael Myers stalked the streets of Haddonfield and before alien paranoia gripped an Antarctic research station, there was Dark Star. Released in 1974, Dark Star was Carpenter's first foray into feature-length filmmaking. It's a quirky mashup of low-budget sci-fi and dark comedy, a movie that feels like 2001: A Space Odyssey went to a college house party. What makes this film so special isn't just its humor or its scrappy DIY production values. It's the way it showcases Carpenter's raw, untamed creativity. Even in his early work, you can see the sparks of brilliance that would later define his career. The knack for atmosphere, the tension bubbling just under the surface, and his ability to craft compelling stories even with limited resources. And let's talk about that charm, because Dark Star is weird, it's funny, it's low budget, but it's utterly captivating in its honesty and ambition. It's a movie that says, yeah, we don't have the budget of a Hollywood blockbuster, but we're going to make you feel something anyway. For those new to Carpenter, this film is like peeking behind the curtain at the early sketches of a masterpiece. For longtime fans, it's a reminder that even legends had to start somewhere. So buckle up, space travelers. We're about to explore the bizarre, often hilarious, and surprisingly thoughtful world of Dark Star. Let's dive into the story of Dark Star, and trust me, it's anything but your typical space adventure. Picture this, a rickety spaceship hurtling through the void on a 20-year mission to destroy unstable planets deemed a threat to human colonization efforts. Sounds like a standard sci-fi premise, right? Something that could rival Star Trek or 2001 in gravitas. Well, not quite. Dark Star takes the setup and flips it on its head, delivering a bizarre, often hilarious exploration of the mundane and the absurd in space travel. The crew is, to put it kindly, a hot mess. They're not heroic astronauts or brilliant scientists. They're overworked, underwhelmed, and completely out of their depth. You've got Doolittle, the reluctant leader who'd rather be surfing on Earth than navigating the cosmos. Then there's Boiler, a trigger-happy, no-nonsense guy who seems more interested in destruction than diplomacy. Pinback is the oddball of the group, constantly stirring up chaos with his antics, while Talby, the quiet dreamer, spends his days gazing into the infinite stars, longing for something more. And then, of course, there's the alien. Oh yes, we need to talk about the alien. Imagine a sentient beach ball with feet. It bounces, it waddles, it antagonizes the crew. It's ridiculous, yet somehow endearing. And it delivers one of the film's most memorable sequences. Equal parts slapstick comedy and tense standoff. Now let's talk tone. While the plot might sound like a space opera, Dark Star is far from it. Instead, it's a darkly comedic exploration of existential themes. What does it mean to have purpose? How do we cope with isolation? What happens when the technology we rely on starts questioning its own existence? Carpenter and co-writer Dan O'Bannon infuse the film with a sense of absurdity that's deeply human. Life aboard the Dark Star isn't glamorous. It's a grind. The ship is falling apart. The crew is apathetic, and the artificial intelligence, aptly named Bomb Number 20, is having an existential crisis of its own. If 2001: A Space Odyssey is the meditative masterpiece of space exploration, Dark Star is the chaotic cousin who shows up uninvited to the family dinner with a six-pack of cheap beer and some wild stories to tell. It's messy, hilarious, and strangely poignant. By the end of the movie, you'll find yourself laughing at the absurdity while also reflecting on the deeper questions it poses. And that's kind of the magic of Dark Star. It's more than a film, it's an experience. All right, horror and sci-fi fans, buckle up, because the story behind Dark Star is just as fascinating as the film itself. Dark Star began as a student film, the brainchild of two budding filmmakers, John Carpenter and Dan O'Bannon. Yep, that Dan O'Bannon, the guy who would later scare the pants off the world with Alien. Back in the early 70s, they were just two ambitious film students at the University of Southern California, dreaming big but working with, well, not so big resources. The entire project was made on a budget of around $60,000, which even back then was barely enough to cover craft services, let alone an entire sci-fi feature. But here's where Carpenter and O'Bannon really shine. They didn't let the lack of funding hold them back. Instead, they leaned into it, using their creativity to make up for what they couldn't afford in traditional production values. Carpenter took on the ultimate multitasking gig. He directed, co-wrote, edited, and composed the score, a dreamy, synth-heavy soundtrack that would set the tone for his future films. It's no wonder he's known as one of the most hands-on filmmakers in Hollywood. Meanwhile, O'Bannon wasn't just co-writing the script. He also starred as Sergeant Pinback and worked on the visual effects. These two were literally doing it all. Now let's talk about those effects. Because they're wonderful. They show you how to make magic on a dime. The Dark Star spaceship, built from model kits and scrap parts, essentially the filmmaker's version of a cosmic arts and crafts project. And then there's the infamous Alien, a sentient beach ball with claws. It's goofy, it's absurd, and it's unforgettable. The quirky Alien wasn't just a gag. It was a creative solution to budget constraints, proving that ingenuity can be more powerful than million-dollar effects teams. The production wasn't without challenges, of course. Low-budget filmmaking is never smooth sailing, and the Dark Star team had to constantly find workarounds for everything from props to special effects. But it was a labor of love, a project born out of passion and desire to tell a unique story. When the film was finally released in 1974, it didn't exactly light up the box office. Audiences didn't know what to make of this odd blend of comedy and sci-fi existentialism. Critics were lukewarm, and the film seemed destined to fade into obscurity. But here's where the magic of cult cinema kicks in. Over time, Dark Star found its audience. Its offbeat humor, innovative storytelling, and DIY charm struck a chord with fans who appreciated its uniqueness. Today, it's celebrated as a cult classic and an essential entry in Carpenter's filmography. It's also a fascinating look at where Carpenter and O'Bannon got their start, a glimpse of the talent and creativity that would later revolutionize sci-fi and horror cinema. So whether you see Dark Star as a scrappy underdog story or an early showcase of two filmmaking legends in the making, one thing's for sure, it's a testament to what's possible when passion meets ingenuity. One of the coolest things about Dark Star is how it's like looking through a time machine into the early seeds of John Carpenter's signature style. Even in his first feature-length film, you can already see the building blocks of what would define his career as a horror and sci-fi master. Starting with the music, Carpenter's synth-heavy score for Dark Star is the perfect example of his knack for using sound to shape mood. It's quirky, melancholic, and a little offbeat, much like the movie itself. The soundtrack doesn't accompany the scenes, it defines them, gives the film unique, otherworldly quality that stands out even today. Carpenter would later perfect this approach in films like Halloween and Escape from New York, where his scores became as iconic as the movies themselves. Visually, Dark Star leans into minimalism, a Carpenter trademark. The cinematography works wonders with the cramped spaceship sets, turning the limited space into an advantage. That sense of claustrophobia, the feeling of being trapped in the cold void of space, is palpable, a technique Carpenter would later use to terrifying effect in The Thing. The way he uses light and shadow here shows that even with a tiny budget, he knew how to craft tension and atmosphere. Then there's the pacing. Carpenter's ability to take the time and let tension simmer is already on display in Dark Star. Silence isn't just the absence of sound, it's a tool. Long stretches of quiet, juxtaposed with bursts of absurdity, create a rhythm that keeps you engaged, even when the plot slows down. This measured pacing would later become a cornerstone of his work, especially in our previous episode on Halloween, where every pause feels like it's hiding something sinister. But what really sets Dark Star apart is its narrative approach. Carpenter and O'Bannon take the classic sci-fi setup, space explorers on a mission, and turn it on its head. Instead of brave, heroic astronauts, we get a crew that's bored out of their minds, disillusioned, and hilariously human. These aren't your typical genre protagonists, and that subversion is where Carpenter's genius shines. He's always had a knack for blending humor, existential dread, and genre conventions into something fresh and unique. Ultimately, Dark Star isn't just a quirky sci-fi film. It's a blueprint for the themes and techniques that would define Carpenter's career. It's like seeing an artist's sketch of their first masterpiece before they had all the tools they'd later master. Dark Star may not be Carpenter's most famous or polished film. Its influence on cinema, and sci-fi in particular, is massive. Let's start with Dan O'Bannon. After Dark Star, he took some of the ideas he and Carpenter explored in this movie, like the relationship between humans and rebellious technology, and cranked up the horror. The result? Alien. The DNA of one of the scariest movies of all time can be traced right back to a sentient beach ball in Dark Star. That mix of existential dread, isolation, and dark humor evolved into a full-blown nightmare in Alien, and the impact is undeniable. But the ripple effects don't stop there. The satirical tone of Dark Star paved the way for a whole subgenre of sci-fi comedies. Movies like Galaxy Quest and shows like one of my favorites, Red Dwarf, owe a debt to Dark Star for proving that space doesn't always have to be serious. It can be absurd, messy, and hilariously funny. And then there's the cult status. Over time, Dark Star found its audience, particularly among fans of offbeat, low-budget films. But what makes it resonate? It's the charm, the ingenuity of turning budget constraints into creative triumphs, the quirky characters and those unforgettable moments. I mean, who could forget the beach ball alien chase? It's ridiculous, but it's oddly poignant. It's a moment that captures what makes Dark Star so special. It never takes itself too seriously, and it's not afraid to explore deeper themes either. So while Dark Star was never going to be a box office hit, its legacy is alive and well. It's a reminder of where John Carpenter started, and a testament to how much you can achieve with passion, creativity, and just a little sense of humor. When Dark Star first hit theaters back in 1974, it didn't make waves. Critics were a little conflicted. Some praised its ingenuity and its offbeat humor, while others didn't quite know what to make of its quirky mix of low-budget sci-fi and absurd comedy. It was like 2001 had collided with Monty Python, and not everyone was ready for that. But here's the thing about movies like Dark Star. Time has a way of revealing their true value. Over the decades, the film has been reevaluated and embraced as a classic. Fans and modern critics now see it for what it is, not just an entertaining oddity, but a fascinating stepping stone in the careers of both John Carpenter and Dan O'Bannon. Today, Dark Star stands as a testament to the creativity that can flourish under constraints. Its limited budget didn't hold it back. It fueled its charm. Modern audiences appreciate the film's cleverness, the willingness to take risks, and the ability to find humor in existential questions. It's a film that doesn't try to hide its rough edges. Instead, it leans into them, giving us something raw and unapologetically unique. And let's be honest, knowing this was Carpenter's first feature makes it even more endearing. It's like watching that rough sketch from the master. You can see the early strokes of brilliance that would later define a career. So let's dive into one of my absolute favorite scenes, the showdown with the sentient bomb. If you've seen the movie, you know exactly what I'm talking about. If you haven't, well, pause right here and go watch it. It's on Amazon Prime. Or I'll set the stage. The bomb, a hyper-intelligent piece of weaponry, is armed and ready to detonate. But it's having an existential crisis. The crew, desperate to prevent disaster, tries to talk it down, leading to a surreal debate about the nature of coexistence and the bomb's purpose in the universe. This scene is the ultimate in absurdist tension. It's philosophical, it's funny, it's thought-provoking. The bomb's logical but naive reasoning is both hilarious and unsettling. And the fact that the entire fate of the crew hinges on this debate? Pure genius. It perfectly encapsulates the film's tone, the blend of humor and dread that feels uniquely Carpenter. But the scene also speaks to something deeper. It's about the fragility of human control and the unintended consequences of our creations. The crew's inability to manage their technology reflects broader themes of man versus machine, a theme Carpenter would revisit in later works. And the dark comedy of the situation? Well, that's a precursor to Carpenter's ability to find levity in the bleakest scenarios. What really set Dark Star apart in Carpenter's filmography, besides being the first, is the rawness. It's experimental, unapologetic, unpolished, and a little chaotic. And that's what makes it special. It's a snapshot of Carpenter and O'Bannon at the start of their careers, taking big swings with limited resources and showing a kind of creative fearlessness that would define their work. Watching Dark Star, it's rough around the edges, but it's bursting with ideas, energy, and a sense of unfiltered passion. And for me, that's what makes it worth revisiting. It's not just a movie, it's a reminder that even the greatest creators start somewhere. And sometimes that somewhere includes a philosophical bomb and a beach ball alien. So yeah, Dark Star is weird, but it's the kind of weird that sticks with you. And I mean that in the best possible way. So where does Dark Star land in the grand tapestry of John Carpenter's career? It's a fascinating starting point. A film that doesn't just show promise, but practically screams it from the deck of its rickety spaceship. Sure, it's rough around the edges, but that's its charm. It's like watching the first brushstrokes of that artist in their eventual masterpiece. Even with its tiny budget and quirky tone, Dark Star manages somehow to be ambitious, thought-provoking, and entertaining. Carpenter's minimalist storytelling and knack for building atmosphere are already evident, and you can see the DNA of his later, more polished work taking shape here. Would I recommend it? Absolutely. If you're a Carpenter fan, this is a must-watch. A glimpse into the origins of a filmmaker who would go on to define an entire genre. And if you're new to Carpenter, it's a great way to see how it all began. Just don't go in expecting The Thing or Halloween. Go in expecting something raw, experimental, and weird. As for my score, well, for me, Dark Star is an 8 out of 10. It's clever, innovative, and proof that creativity can thrive even when resources are limited. And that's going to wrap up this dive into Dark Star, but don't go too far. Next week, we're leaving the quirky humor of space behind and heading to the icy isolation of Antarctica. That's right, we'll be breaking down John Carpenter's The Thing. If you thought Dark Star was a fascinating start, wait until you see how Carpenter crafts one of the most intense, paranoia-filled films I've ever seen. From its groundbreaking practical effects to its chilling score and claustrophobic atmosphere, The Thing isn't just a horror movie. It is a masterclass in tension and storytelling, so mark your calendars. Join me next week as we continue this journey through the films of John Carpenter. And hey, if you enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to subscribe, rate, review the podcast. And also follow us over on Instagram and Threads at Real Talk to share your thoughts on Dark Star. And let me know what you're most excited to hear about in the coming episodes. And always, thanks for tuning in to Real Talk Horror. Check out our other podcast, just Real Talk, where we dive into mostly non-horror cinema. There's some crossover, but it's more broad. And until next time, dim those lights, heat up the popcorn, and get the movies rolling. We'll see you real soon.